This podcast contains adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. My name is Eric Rivenes, and pleased as punch to have you here with me. Okay, so make a nice cup of tea for this episode, perhaps flavored with nutmeg or some other spice favored by the Dutch East India Company. We are traveling back to 1629 and the western coast of Australia. It is the tale of the Batavia, a Dutch ship on its way to buy spices when it suffers both a shipwreck and a mutiny of terrible proportions. I'm very pleased today to be speaking to the author of Batavia's Graveyard. It is a thrilling, jaw-dropping, absolutely horrific story, brilliantly brought to life by my guest, Mike Dash. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me.
Pleasure.
So this book fires on so many cylinders. It is a story about the vilest of villains, incredible heroes, and a plot line that exceeds anything to ever come out of Hollywood. And one of the most interesting characters in your book is not even human. It is the Batavia, a marvel of naval engineering, incredibly advanced in the 1620s, but at the same time, for modern readers, a virtual hellhole on the high seas. Tell us about this incredible ship and the Dutch East India Company that commissioned it.
Yes, I mean, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, that's the Dutch abbreviation of its name, was founded in 1602 at the very beginning of the Dutch age of exploration, and its purpose was to make as much profit as possible in the East Indies spice trade. That was the luxury trade of the day. The reason being that in the age before refrigeration, essentially when it was very difficult to prevent meat from getting tainted and starting to rot, spices were actually pretty much imperative just to have a palatable meal. And bringing over not just the traditional pepper, which was sort of the biggest, most available spice, but the real luxury ones that cost the most money, which were things like nutmeg and cinnamon, which could only be found in very small areas of the East Indies, what's now Indonesia, was what the East India Company was all about. And in order to do that, they had to build a whole fleet of merchant ships, which at the same time had to be capable of defending themselves against sort of local piracy and so on. So the Batavia was a sort of modern, in modern terms, it was sort of a multi-purpose ship. It was designed to hold as much cargo as possible. It had a gun deck and a fairly serious battery of armament. And that meant that it had a kind of the sort of crew that was sort of more or less bound to cause trouble sooner or later, because at one side it had a whole group of merchants, and the merchants were, bizarrely enough, and I think this is fairly unique to the East India Company actually, they were the people actually in charge of the voyage. So the skipper of the ship was not in fact the most senior person on board, but the upper merchant, the senior VOC representative on board, was the most senior person in charge, and he could tell the skipper what to do within sort of fairly broad parameters. So there's one potential source of conflict right there, and then you have a mixed crew of soldiers, sailors who never get on very well, and again, rather uniquely to the East India Company, in order to make it possible to even recruit people in the first place and send them to a place where infectious disease would wipe out well over half of the people who go out to the East Indies are just never going to come back. They also had a fairly large complement of women. So in the Batavia's case, there were something like 25 women on board, which again is really, really unusual. And 25 women and 300 men is also a bit of an incendiary kind of a mix. And these people are all stuffed into a ship which, as you say, I mean, by contemporary standards, it was a modern of technology, but by our standards, it was, tiny, cramped, uncomfortable, all the things again that would make life, pretty hideous. The ship itself had, as I mentioned, about 340 people on board when she sailed. That's about 160 foot long. Only a few of the officers had private cabins. Everyone else was sleeping in communal sleeping areas. This is before the invention of the hammock, or just after the invention of the hammock. Almost everybody's sleeping on slightly hard, uncomfortable sleeping pads on a rocking, rolling ship. The only hot food comes from a tiny galley. Everything pretty much after the first couple of weeks is going to be stored, preserved food, which is heavily salted and pretty unpalatable and very difficult to cook. And then you're sailing this ship, of course, all the way from Holland down to Indonesia, around Africa. So you're undergoing extremes of temperature. You start off in the sort of freezing cold Dutch midwinter. You go through the tropics where it's boiling hot in the doldrums where you don't have any wind, and then you have to round Africa and finally pick up the sort of fast currents that will eventually speed the voyage. And so in the course of all of that, the meat and the food on board is being subjected to the same extremes of temperature, and what you tend to find happening is a sort of huge proliferation of the insect population on the ship. One of the most remarkable stats I remember when I was researching it, which I think made its way into the book, was that a Danish ship of the same type, doing the same route, the captain offered a tot of rum for every 1,000 cockroaches the crew could catch, and found himself with something like 38,000 dead cockroaches on his desk the next morning. And a lot of these insects were finding their way into the food, of course. And I think that one of the things that people most remember from the book, and it's remarkable given, as I'm sure we're going to come on to, the sort of debauchery and murder that goes on in this story. But one of the most memorable things for a lot of people is the fact that, the hard tack, the ship's biscuit, has 3 different sorts of insect in it. It has sort of weevils and worms. And these insects have very different tastes that you can tell. The cockroaches taste of sausage, the weevils taste sort of sour and bitter, and you kind of have to try and bang as many of these insects out as you possibly can against the side of the ship before you eat the food with whatever insects remain inside it. So one way and another, you really are talking about a very uncomfortable voyage. This is before the invention of suntan lotion, for example. Everyone's wearing hot, heavy, dark, woolen clothes for the whole of the voyage. The whole thing must have just been almost unbearable by modern standards. And that's before you get to the discipline on board, of course.
Right. Could you set the scene for us on the Batavia as it headed out to sea? Who were the figures on the ship that played pivotal roles in the story?
Well, there are several people who need to be mentioned here. One of the things you've got to bear in mind, of course, is that the East India Company, although it's the largest company in the world at this time, it's a relatively small community at the top end, and people bump into each other on different voyages, and there's lots of previous, as we might say, involved in the story of the Batavia. And the most significant instance of this is the rivalry and the poor relationship between the upper merchant, who, as I mentioned, is the senior guy on board, whose name was Francis Pelsart, who was a veteran who had spent quite a lot of time in India. But rather unusually for the VOC, he was actually not Dutch. He came from the Spanish Netherlands, which is now Belgium, and he had originally been a Catholic, which in theory should have meant he shouldn't have been recruited in the first place, but he had influential relatives. So he was a rather odd fish. And up against him was the skipper of the ship, whose name was Aaron Jacobs, who was kind of almost a classic idea of an old salt. I mean, he was probably the oldest man on board, maybe about 45, a superb seaman, but also a drunkard and a lecher who spent quite a lot of his spare time cozying up to the various women on board and trying to seduce them. So these two guys, the rather fastidious, rather weak Pelsart and the sort of blustery old salt Jacobs were enemies and didn't get on at all well, and that sort of did underlie quite a lot of the problems that happened later on. To make matters worse, Pelsart's deputy, who was a failed apothecary called Jeronimus Corenlisz, turned out to be the villain of the piece. Jeronimus was a very, very unusual character for the time, insofar as we can tell, and it's obviously very difficult sometimes to do sort of post hoc psychoanalysis. Is a dangerous thing to do, but he did have very many of the characteristics of a psychopath, which in a communal society like the Netherlands in the 17th century was a pretty unusual type of person. And he had a sort of catastrophic personal history behind him. He'd been born in Friesland, which is the northern part of the Netherlands, and had moved south with his wife to the sort of posher part, to a town called Haarlem, where he'd set up an apothecary's shop. And after a couple of years, it had failed catastrophically. And from the research I did for the book, I found the reason for this, which was that his wife had had a baby in common with all the middle classes in the Netherlands At that time, she had farmed the baby out to a wet nurse. And after a few months, the baby was handed back to her badly infected with syphilis, of which it died at the age of sort of 8 or 10 months. So the word of this got out. And of course, a large proportion of the customers of the apothecary shop assumed that either Jeronimus or his wife must have been unfaithful to each other or to have acquired the syphilis, which caused their clientele to basically abandon them, and their business went bankrupt. Jeronimus's version of events was that the child probably acquired the syphilis from the wet nurse, and from a medical point of view, that is in fact possible. But there was a huge disgrace, therefore, in his background, and he was forced essentially to join this rather suicidal voyage to the east in order to try to recover his fortunes. And his main driver was, in fact, to become as wealthy as possible, as quickly as possible. I don't think he particularly felt he had very much to go back to in the Netherlands either, having had a falling out with his wife over the business of where the syphilis had come from, having lost his business, having been disgraced within his own community. He was a pretty desperate man. So those are the three main male characters that one needs to know about at the beginning of the story anyway. But there is one fourth person I should mention. And this is the sort of femme fatale of the story, a woman called Lucretia, who was the extraordinarily beautiful wife of another merchant of the East India Company who was already out in Burma, trading in slaves, in fact, and she was sailing out to join him. So she was there with her maid, but effectively an unaccompanied woman of, some youth, and we're told by several different sources, remarkably attractive, and she was a magnet for the attentions of all three of the first guys I mentioned in the course of the voyage. And that's really where things start to go wrong.
In your book, you delve quite a bit into Cornelius's background, and as you've already mentioned, he's got a pretty notorious backstory coming into this voyage. One of the most interesting connections he might have had was to a militant sect of the Anabaptists called the Battenbergers. Is that correct?
Well, I can't prove it. It seems likely, given the beliefs of this particular sect and what happens on the island, which perhaps we can go into a bit later. But again, I mean, it's one of those things that it has kind of been lost to a lot of people's sort of understanding of history. I mean, nowadays people look on the Anabaptists as, if you think about it, the Amish are probably the best known Anabaptists, certainly in the States, and they actually emerged effectively as a sort of counterbalance, as a sort of response to the really quite extraordinary events that happened in Anabaptist history in the century before the Batavia set sail. Because when the Anabaptists got started in the 1520s, they were a sort of radical apocalyptic millenarian sect. And their belief was essentially that, the second coming of Christ was fairly imminent, and it could be hastened by building a new Jerusalem for him to return to. And that required them to sort of seize control of some town and turn it into a sort of perfect Christian society. And they succeeded rather amazingly, really, in retrospect, in getting hold of a town called Munster, which is on the German-Dutch border. They expelled everybody else, called all their co-religionists in, and sort of fortified the town against the inevitable counter-strike. And to give you some idea of just how radical a thing this was, this is at the time of Luther and the beginning of the Reformation. The Catholics and the Lutherans got together. They ganged up on the Anabaptists in order to retake the city, which is, again, a pretty unique event. And everybody in the city was massacred or tortured to death. And that was more or less the end of this millenarian Anabaptism, except that a small group who hadn't been in the city, led by a man called Jan van Battenberg, did continue to exist in the extremes of the Frisian countryside for about another 40 or 50 years afterwards. So we're talking about sort of the second half of the 16th century. And they then themselves, when they were sort of persecuted out of existence, had a couple of later splinter sects. And, the beliefs of this particular group of Anabaptists were, essentially, in some respects, what we would now think of as almost communist, having property in common, including women, for example, would be one of them. And certainly a belief in the idea that you're getting messages essentially sort of directly from God, that the Anabaptists didn't have a sort of priesthood. It's all a personal relationship with God. So, that's one strand of Cornelius's beliefs, but the other strand, which kind of ties in rather unfortunately with it, seems to have been picked up from a painter who lived in the same town, Haarlem, as Cornelius, called Terentius. And Terentius was essentially a libertine, which in that particular sense, means something rather specific. He believed in the idea of having pleasure on earth. He believed in the idea as well, I think, that it was important to cast aside the bounds of conventional society and to live a life which was about self-fulfillment. And Cornelius, who according to a number of the documents at the time was sort of a disciple of Terentius, seemed to have picked up some of these opinions. So he has this sort of belief in, the Anabaptist belief that everyone else's property should be his as well. He has the Terentian belief in, taking control of the situation and not binding himself by the conventional morality of the time. And he has psychopathic tendencies. And that's a pretty dangerous trio of beliefs. On board the Batavia, all of that is rather submerged because he has to exist under the control of the VOC, which certainly wasn't a tolerant society. But of course, things maybe happen in the course of the voyage that free him up from these constraints. And again, that's one of the threads we have to follow as we go through the story.
Right. So the Batavia is well on its way to the Dutch East Indies when the whispers of mutiny began. How did the plot to overthrow the ship unfold?
It's difficult to be absolutely certain about this because we only have Pelsart's word for it. And after the events that we're going through, he sort of held a court of inquiry, which I think was fairly obviously in large part designed to exculpate himself from any blame. So we have to take some of the things he says with a pinch of salt. But the story that he told, and which came out under torture, which again makes it perhaps slightly questionable, was that Cornelius and Jacobs, the skipper, formed a friendship and decided that rather than go ahead and with the voyage, it was designed to essentially give them a small salary whilst making a gigantic fortune for the directors of the East India Company. It would be a much better idea to mutiny and seize the ship. So the ship was carrying a gigantic amount of silver. Europe at this point made no trade goods that anybody really in the East Indies wanted to buy. So the only way of trading with them was you sent out money and you brought back cargo. So there were 12 or 13 large chests of silver which are kept in the captain's cabin. And if you could seize control of the ship, then that money would become yours. You could sail off to some sort of paradisical island in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar had several sort of prototype pirate communities already by this stage. And all you really needed was to get control of sufficient people to batten down the hatches to stop the soldiers from coming up and retaking the ship, chuck some of the leading people, probably including Pelsart, overboard, and you could in fact seize control of the ship with maybe 25 or 30 people. And Jacobs and Cornelius between them were in quite a good position to do that. Jacobs obviously knew intimately all the seamen on board and who was discontented, who was disgruntled, who was violent, and who he could depend upon. And Cornelius was a really remarkably sort of persuasive character. I mean, he was very well educated by the standards of the time. And I think that a lot of the people on board who were very badly educated found it very seductive to be talking to somebody who had such great command of words and was eloquent and obviously highly educated and could kind of spin fantasies almost of what their life after this mutiny would be. And so between them, they started to recruit members of the crew for this planned mutiny. And the thing that sort of set everything else in motion was that in order to disgrace and persuade the crew that Pelsart wasn't on their side, they decided that the best thing to do would be to launch an attack on Lucretia, this beautiful woman I mentioned earlier. Now, by this stage, Pelsart had made it pretty obvious that he felt he was in love with her, and what they hoped was that by doing something truly disgraceful to her, they would tip him over the edge, and he would react with such violent reprisals against the crew that they would be, much more likely to want him out, essentially. So one night after dinner, while Lucretia was taking a stroll on deck, she was set upon by a gang of masked men who the captain had recruited, and she had various sort of dung smeared over her, and she was sort of dipped into the sea on the end of a rope, and generally kind of left as a quivering wreck in the sort of cubbyhole on the side of the ship. Pelsart didn't react as they had hoped he would, because he was extremely ill by this point, and he felt, I think, that he was too far from help and didn't know quite how many people he could rely on, and he decided to wait until he got closer to the East Indies before taking action. So the plan to incite a mutiny failed, and it was while the captain and Cornelius were trying to come up with an alternative way of getting their hands on the ship that they began to sail into the dangerous waters of Western Australia.
So as you mentioned before, Cornelius and Jacobs are able to successfully complete their mutiny, a disaster happens. On June 4th of 1629, the Batavia strikes a reef. Can you tell us about how and where it happened?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of people who know even a little bit about Australian history are quite surprised to know that the west coast of Australia was being visited by anybody at this point, because we're about 150, 160 years before Captain Cook and the British colonisation of the far coast, the east coast. But essentially, what happened was that in about 1610, the Dutch, who'd been trading with the East Indies at that point for about 15 years, and had been doing it in a very inefficient way by rounding the coast of Africa and then sailing up to Madagascar and across to Malaysia and then around. And I mean, against the currents and the prevailing winds, it used to take about 18 months to go from Amsterdam to what's now Jakarta, what was then the town of Batavia. But a ship that got blown further south discovered that there's a very strong current that runs across the Roaring Forties about 800, 900 miles south of South Africa, which actually cuts something like 8 or 9 months off the voyage. So the ship started sailing south into this current, and the idea was you'd sail east until you reach the right point, then turn north, and you'd sort of intersect with the Sunda Strait, which separates Java from Sumatra, and that was where you wanted to be. Now, the problem at this point was that required you to know what your longitude was, and there was in the 17th century no adequate way of accurately measuring longitude. It wasn't for another 100 and something years that accurate enough clocks to allow that particular measurement were invented. So you were really working on sort of ready reckoning. And if the winds were a little bit stronger than you reckoned, or the current was a little bit fiercer than you reckoned, you would essentially sail too far to the east. You would end up sort of hitting the coast of Australia or some of the shoals that were off the coast of Australia. And what happened to Batavia was that it ran aground in a set of coral islands called Houtman's Abrolhos, which is about 2 days sail north of Perth, which of course didn't exist at that time, and about 60 miles off the coast of Australia. And these islands are very low lying, and it's very hard to see them at the best of times. And the Batavia was unfortunate enough to come across them in the middle of the night, and she struck one of the reefs before anything could be done, and impaled herself on it so firmly that they couldn't get her off. So the next morning, when it became obvious that the ship was completely stranded, they had to organise an evacuation. And again, I mean, we have to remember that in the 17th century, there's no such thing as lifeboats for everybody. This is well before the Titanic, and there were only 2 small boats on board. So it took them pretty much the whole day to evacuate the people onto these little lumps of coral. And we're talking about not a sort of classic desert island with palm trees, coconuts, white beaches, and sort of babbling brooks. We're talking about a desert essentially. I mean, it's literally just dark lumps of bones of coral, no shelter, no fresh water at all. The only food that's available is a few sea lions and birds if you can catch them, and what you can take off the ship. And it wasn't very long before the Batavia broke her back and disintegrated, so they weren't able to bring ashore nearly enough supplies. Almost everybody survived the disaster. Only about 40 or 50 people drowned in the course of this rather chaotic evacuation. So we're left with sort of 280 people in a very dangerous situation, with enough supplies really to last them for only a matter of a few days. And Cornelius, at that point, when he did get ashore, he found himself in command, because what had happened was that Pelsart and Jacobs had decided that the only possible way of saving everybody's lives was to head for the mainland and try and find some water. So they went off in the boats, taking with them pretty much all of the able seamen, and headed for Australia. And they weren't able to find fresh water, so they decided that the only way that they could possibly survive themselves was to head for Batavia and try and mount a rescue mission from there. So they were out of the way. Cornelius was the senior man in charge, and he finds himself in this rather desperate situation of having 280 odd survivors to guard, to protect, to save, and not nearly enough supplies to do so.
So Cornelius, as you say, has found himself the commanding officer in charge of the survivors, and it's kind of like the wolf in control of the henhouse. And it quickly devolves into a Lord of the Flies situation in the most brutal way possible. And I know it's impossible to know exactly what is going on in his mind at this point, but you've researched him extensively. What do you think his mindset might have been as he surveyed the situation in front of him? And what do you think his goals were?
Well, you're right in saying, we can, to a certain extent, we can only speculate. We do have quite a lot of evidence from, later interrogations of his followers. I mean, there are several things going through his mind at this point. The first thing is obviously rather uniquely amongst the survivors. For him, a rescue mission is probably not very good news. He doesn't know how much Pelsart knows about the planned mutiny. He doesn't know what Pelsart and Jacobs might be saying to each other on this boat as it sails slowly up towards the East Indies, or whether his confederate is setting him out in order to save his own life or anything like that. But he's got a pretty good suspicion that if a rescue mission does in fact eventually turn up, it might be really bad news for him, because he's going to be arrested, thrown into chains, taken north and executed. So the last thing he wants is a successful rescue mission. But I think a couple of other possibilities suggest themselves to him at this point. The first thing is that amongst the survivors, there are at least 20 of the men who he had already co-opted into the mutiny. And he almost immediately sort of reactivates this group, and they become effectively the ruling class on the island. So the situation for everybody else is pretty impossible, for several reasons. Firstly, Cornelius, as the senior East India Company man on board, has absolute authority and life or death power over everybody else, just by virtue of being the senior officer. In addition to that, he has, a gang of 25 cutthroats at his back, and they control all of the weapons. So nobody else has, they have the swords, the muskets, the spears, and nobody else has anything to fight back with. And thirdly, only about 1 in 7 people at this period could swim at all, and they're stuck on a tiny island. It's about the size of 2 football fields put together, with essentially therefore almost no way of getting off. And so everybody is sort of absolutely at him and his thugs' mercy. And I think that he thinks that there are, 2 possible things that might happen. If a rescue ship arrives, his plan is that they'll rush it, they'll seize control of the rescue ship, throw all the officers of that ship overboard, and turn pirate, as they had originally planned to do. I should have mentioned in my previous answer that in accordance with the rules of the VOC, the first thing they'd done after they ran ashore was to take all the silver on shore before they rescued anybody. They rescued the money, and that's what the Dutch East India Company was just like. So the silver was still there, and they could still, if they could get it onto a ship that was capable of navigating, they could still sort of carry out plan A. If plan B had to be put into place, plan B was essentially for Cornelius and his guys to survive as long as possible. And in order to survive as long as possible, they had to start thinning out the ranks of the survivors, because they soon ran through the sea lions. There weren't enough birds, there was not enough food, and certainly not enough water. And so the plan was essentially to split the group up, get rid of the most dangerous people by shipping them over, using sort of driftwood canoes and rafts that they made, ship them off to other islands where they could be isolated, and then start whittling down the numbers of people who were left to the point where there'd be enough food and everyone could at least live reasonably comfortably with their captive women in this in this sort of group of islands.
And Cornelius shows really how cunning and intelligent he is, because the men he sends off are the soldiers and the hired mercenaries who would prove to be a physical threat to him. And he does this, of course, so he can carry out his dastardly plans without opposition.
Absolutely. I mean, he's not unintelligent, as many of the great villains of history, of course, haven't been. And even though these soldiers have been disarmed, Cornelius, as one of his first orders, sort of says everyone should put their weapons into a central store, which, as I say, he and his men effectively then have complete control over. But just by virtue of their military training, these other guys, and the fact that they're young, fit, healthy guys, they are a potential threat to him. So yes, I mean, the very first thing almost he does is to ship off almost the whole of the group of soldiers under the command of a guy called Weber Hayes, who was just an ordinary private soldier. But he obviously had some fairly extraordinary qualities, because he was sort of elected as the leader of this group of soldiers when all of their officers went off with Pelsart in the boat. So Weber Hayes was told to take his 40 men off to another island, where Cornelius was pretty sure they were going to basically just they were going to be left to die of thirst. I mean, the promise, of course, was go over there, have a look around. If you find some supplies, sort of set a fire, and we'll come and get you. And if you don't, we'll resupply you with some water. And of course, he has no intention of resupplying them with some water, and there's no reason, as far as Cornelius is concerned, to imagine there could possibly be anything more on this island he's sending them to than is already available on the island they start off with, which, as I say, is essentially completely barren. And this is one of the, I guess this is one of the things that encourages one to think of Cornelius as being a sort of psychopathic character, because one of the characteristics of psychopaths is sort of grandiose schemes and terrible planning. And he had failed dismally to properly explore the island he was planning to exile Hayes and his men to. And it turned out to be actually by far the most fertile of all the islands in the archipelago. It had a number of underground cisterns where a fair amount of rainwater had collected. And there was a fair bit of local wildlife. There was a small species of wallaby, there were snakes, there were lots of birds, fishing holes. And in fact, Hayes and his men found themselves in a position, bizarrely, and this is the great tragedy in the sense of the whole Batavia story, was that they soon realised that if the whole of the survivors were assembled on this much larger island, it's about 4 miles by a mile, they could have all survived quite handily there for indefinitely, essentially, by husbanding their resources. But when they lit the signal fires to say that there was, where they found all this food and water, Cornelius responded by, not going to rescue them. So what you end up with is a situation where there's a sort of standoff in the islands, and eventually Hayes and his men realise what's going on the other island, because when the massacres begin, one or two survivors who are able to get hold of a lump of wood and sort of, make their way over, supported by it, to this other island, let them know what's going on, and so you end up with a situation where there's two armed camps. But before that happens, of course, you have the beginnings of a Lord of the Flies type situation, as you mentioned, on Batavia's graveyard. That's the island that the survivors had put themselves became known.
Hello all, Eric here. So if you are not a big fan of advertisements disrupting the flow of an interview, there is an option. Go to patreon.com/mostnotorious, and for just $2 a month, get all my episodes ad-free. This will not only be for the Most Notorious podcast, but also for my new podcast debuting in September of 2018 called Where Blood Runs Cold, a collection of terrifying, historical, true crime stories from my home state, Minnesota. And for $4 a month, you'll not only get the ad-free episodes, but bonus content as well, including extra episodes, special commentary, and more. So skip the ads, support the show, and listen to new stuff by going to patreon.com/mostnotorious. That's Patreon, patreon.com/mostnotorious. See ya there. Cheers. Now back to the interview. So the killings began almost secretly, and Cornelius is pretty covert in how he begins to eliminate people. But eventually his group becomes bolder, and a kind of bloodlust sets in, really putting the remaining survivors in a constant fear for their lives. Could you explain how this transition occurred?
Yeah, so just to sort of set the scene for you, as I mentioned, the Abrolhos are an archipelago of islands. There's 5 or 6 major ones. So you've got to imagine on one of the small ones, you've got the remainder of Cornelius's men and a largish group of civilians and all the women. So we're talking there maybe about 125 people who are on Batavia's graveyard. Hayes and his men have been put onto another island, so they're out of the way. That's 40 men. Another 45 guys have been put onto a third island, and there's another 60 on a fourth island. So the group have been split into 4 different camps. And what Cornelius did, having done that and established himself with a sort of controllable group of people, was, as you mentioned, he started by whittling them down rather subtly. Again, he's aided tremendously by the fact that he is, in fact, the sole authority on the island. And the first couple of cases were sort of trumped up charges of, sort of raiding the water cask or something like that. So there were a couple of actual executions that took place that he ordered. And then he began to sort of, get rid of the people again who he thought were going to be most dangerous. So the sort of adult, strong, younger men, would be, co-opted into a fishing party, for example. So three of Cornelius's men and 1 or 2 of these completely innocent bystanders would be on a raft. They sail off sort of over the horizon. When they're out of sight of Batavia's graveyard, 3 mutineers would just turn on the other guys who weren't expecting to be attacked at all and just throw them overboard. And not being able to swim, they'd quite quickly drown. So that happened 2 or 3 times, and then people would just start disappearing on the island. They'd be killed in the middle of the night. Nobody would know what happened to them. Cornelius would say, well, they must have, gone off to join one of the other islands, the guys on one of the other islands. So, it's one of these, you can only imagine how awful it must have been. But over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, I think it gradually becomes apparent to the people on Batavia's graveyard that something really terrible is going on. It's almost like one of these sort of horror movies where it gradually becomes clear that there's sort of like a maniac hiding somewhere in the attic. I mean, Cornelius and his men are that maniac, and you gradually become aware of the situation. And of course, as I say, the situation is that you can't really do anything about it because you have, in many cases, your own family to protect sometimes, or your friends. You have no access to the weapons and no way of getting off the island. And it's almost a matter of waiting for your turn to die at that point and trying to keep your head down and not attracting the murderer's attention. And one of the most tragic finds that archaeologists have made that allow us to establish a little bit about what happened on the island in the course of digging up some of the bodies of the victims of these massacres. They discovered the body of a 6-year-old child whose teeth had been almost ground away by the sort of, teeth grinding in the middle of the night from the stress of which one imagines is largely caused by the stress of the situation of, knowing that you're essentially about to be murdered at almost any moment. In addition to that, Cornelius is also very aware that if a rescue voyage does occur and Pelsart comes back for him, the other people on the other islands can't be allowed to survive long enough to warn Pelsart what's going on. So the mutineers, when they have made enough of these sort of driftwood rafts and so on, start launching raids on the other islands and chasing down the inhabitants of the other islands openly in broad daylight and massacring them. And again, we're talking about islands that are tiny really by modern standards, that are maybe a half a mile or a mile long, very narrow. There's no cover. You're running and you're going to run out of places to run to. And there's 4 or 5 guys at your back with swords, with spears. You can imagine what it would have been like.
One of the really frightening things about this story, and it really scared me when reading your book, are these crazy, savage henchmen that he surrounds himself with. These guys would put James Bond villain henchmen to shame. And one of the scariest in the story is one of the cabin boys. This kid's name is Jan Pelgrim, and he's absolutely terrifying.
Well, I think that, if you're a script writer, you'd be quite proud of yourself for inventing a character like Jan Pelgrim, because of course Cornelius has a way of appealing to sort of tough, brutal thugs on board. And, most of his lieutenants are that sort of person. They're sort of, badly educated, easily seduced with tales of wealth, easily seduced by being offered the chance to rape a few women. They're lowlifes. Pelgrim, comes from a relatively good family. He's, one of these sort of younger sons who are sort of forced off to find their fortune in the colonies, essentially. And he's weak. He's a weedy, weak, 15, 16-year-old boy. And of course, the terrifying thing is that even people like that, put in a position where they're given, some weapons and the backing of a man like Cornelius, can become suddenly powerful. And I think, he becomes drunk essentially on power. He was obviously sort of psychologically fairly disturbed, I think, perhaps. And, he began to just walk around Batavia's graveyard armed with a great big knife, saying, who wants to be stabbed to death? I could do that very prettily. And, with Cornelius at his back, of course, there's nothing to protect you against someone like that. If he decides he doesn't like the look of you that morning, just wants to cut your throat, Cornelius isn't going to stop him. And so, yes, Pelgrim becomes sort of one of the chief killers on the island, even though physically, he's not really capable of overwhelming, even an ordinary sized man or possibly some of the women on board. But with Cornelius's backing, he's able to do this. And there's some truly horrible moments where, guys who Cornelius wants to get rid of are sort of pinioned by some of the other thugs on board, and Pelgrim is allowed to kind of have his way with them while they're completely incapacitated. And as you say, it really is a horrible, terrifying situation to even imagine, much less to actually, of course, be in.
And even talking about just a handful of stories, it doesn't really give the full scope of the brutality. People really need to buy the book to understand it, but I'm going to mention one account, and of all the accounts that you read about, this one was the most difficult for me, and I'm sure for others too. It's the slaughter of the Predicans family, the Bastians, and I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, one of the difficult things about writing this story actually was that there are so many people who get killed. There's 125 murders that take place, and if you just simply go and describe each of these in detail, It's horrible. It's depressing. Nobody wants to read such a bloodbath, as you say. So, many times I didn't go into the sort of detail I could potentially have done from the evidence that was available, just in a sense to sort of, not overwhelm the story. But, the predicant's family was a story that I felt I had to tell in full because, it is representative, but it's also one of the most terrible because, this is a family of 9 people. The predicant. So the predicant is a Dutch word for preacher. So this is the Calvinist minister on board. He's a pretty useless character. He's only again there because he can't find a decent living in the Netherlands. You've got to remember that the Dutch at this point, they're Calvinists, so they believe in the idea of predestination of the soul. In other words, there's nothing you can do effectively once you've been born to say whether or not you're going to go to heaven or hell. Therefore, the Calvinists have no kind of missionary impulse, and so unlike many societies, the East Indies was not full of sort of anxious missionaries who wanted to convert all the local heathen, and hence there wasn't much glory in being a Calvinist minister in the East Indies, just the near certainty of fairly rapid death. So Bastian's Gijsbert Bastian's his name was out there for pretty much the same reason as Cornelius. He had lost his living. He used to own a horse-powered mill at a time when windmills were becoming much more popular and were basically putting the horse-powered guys out of business. So he was another bankrupt, and he'd been forced to sort of flee to the East Indies just to keep his family together. So he was there with his wife and their children and maid. So there were 6 children, and him and his wife and their maid. So as I say, effectively a family of 9. And the oldest of the children was 18, and the youngest was, I think, 6 or 7 years old. And amazingly, they had survived not only the horrors of the voyage and the shipwreck, but for several weeks they survived intact on Batavia's graveyard when these murders began. And Bastian must have hoped, I think, that in part his standing as the minister might protect him. But I think most obviously the thing that protected him was that one of his daughters, Judith, who was 15 at that time, had attracted the attention of one of Cornelius's henchmen, who decided, in fact, that he wanted to marry her. And so, what happened was that Cornelius, having decided, I think, that, the rest of the family were really in the way, Bastians might have some influence, which could be, inconvenient for him. And again, there's just a lot of mouths to feed there. He invited Judith to come with her father for dinner in his tent, with her fiancé, who, of course, she'd not really had much choice in the matter. When he said he wanted to marry her, her father had advised that, it's better to do that than to let us all be killed. So she had essentially had to start a relationship with this rather unpleasant young mutineer who was from he was an illegitimate son of a noble family. And so she'd been forced to sleep with him and was going to have to marry him. And so Cornelius organised this rather distressing dinner, which must have been a bit of a charade as far as the family were concerned, and she and her father went off to it. And knowing that they were out of the way, he then sent his number 1 henchman and his thugs around to the family's tent, and they went into it. They grabbed the lantern that was inside and extinguished it, and then in the confines of this tiny sailcloth tent, they just massacred every other member of the family by using daggers and clubs to smash them to pieces, essentially. And again, there are terrible little sort of vignettes that emerge from this. That the youngest son sort of nearly escapes. He crawled between the legs of one of the mutineers who doesn't notice him going, and is almost out of the tent when they realise, and they just sort of turn around and smash his brains open with an axe. So the rest of the family were all killed, thrown into a pit, and when Judith got back from dinner, her family were all dead. And there was very, very much nothing that she or her father could do about that. Couldn't even, to complain would have been to just lose your own life.
You talked earlier about Lucretia Jans, the beautiful woman on the way to meet her husband, coveted by the officers on the Batavia, and her subsequent humiliation on the deck of the ship, meant to rouse the anger of Pelsart. So she's on the island too, but she doesn't suffer the same fate as most of the other women.
Yes, well, absolutely. And they got into trouble later on, actually. So Cretia, as she was known, that's the sort of diminutive of Lucretia. Cretia was absolutely earmarked for Cornelius' sort of personal use. And again, this sort of tells you something about him. He didn't just sort of seize her and rape her. He went through this incredible sort of perverted almost attempt to seduce her with the sort of, inviting her to his tent, breaking open the best wine that they salvaged from the ship, trying to persuade her that he was a great guy, and that, you know, she should transfer her loyalties to him. Of course, she's a married woman at this point, and she's perfectly aware of what he is. And again, one can only imagine the sort of horrible moral accommodations that she's forced to make with herself. You know, she actually resisted him for quite some time, 10 or 12 days, and eventually Cornelius' lieutenant, a man called David Zabank, he was. This is the guy who massacred the Predicants family. Eventually, he lost his temper and said to Cornelius, you know, you're wasting your time with this woman. I'll make her do what you want. And he went to Lucretia and essentially said, you know, either tonight you sleep with the commandant or I'm going to cut your throat. So she gave in at that point and began a relationship with Cornelius. And, you know, of course, he was, you know, trying to make her the lady of the island, you know, the whole of the idea that she was getting the best clothing available, the finest wines. And I don't think that she can possibly have enjoyed that situation. I don't think she had any choice but to give in to it. But, you know, of course, when she eventually got to Batavia, having survived, a lot of the other women who had been, you know, herded into another tent and essentially were just held as flesh to be peddled out to the mutineers who could just go in there and take one for the evening. They were very jealous of her sort of superior situation. She was only being raped by one man, and they denounced her as a Confederate, in fact, of Cornelius. And there was a court case in Batavia where she was accused of being one of the mutineers, which, you know, she wasn't. But she was in a hideously appalling moral and physical bind, I think, at that point, essentially.
So let's go back to Webber Hayes and the soldiers that Cornelius had hoped would just shrivel up and die. but they don't. As you mentioned, they find food and water and also start hearing rumors about what's going on back on Batavia's graveyard. So they begin to build a defense. Could you walk us through the conflict that begins to escalate between these two camps?
Absolutely. It's a relief to encounter a man like Webber Hayes in this story, because at this point, you know, there are so few heroes. You know, you've got a drunken skipper, a weak-willed merchant, and a bunch of psychopaths. And Hayes is the one person who acts properly and decently in this whole story, pretty much. I mean, to be fair, you know, this isn't Hollywood. You know, he can't mount a raid on the main island and rescue the women, which is undoubtedly what you'd be expected to do if they ever make a film of this. They're going to have to change the story. But what he does do is he fortifies his island and protects the men he's got there and the people who join him slowly as this goes on from attack. And, you know, that is not an easy thing to do because, as I said before, the mutineers have all the sophisticated weaponry, including 2 muskets, which they managed to save from the ship. And all that Hayes has got is what he can manufacture from, you know, what washes up on shore and what's available on this coral island. And he does his best. I mean, the first thing that he did, in fact, was to construct 2 little tiny forts, which he made up with his men from sort of coral rocks. And these still exist, actually, on the island. I went to see them. And they are the oldest European constructions in Australia. So they have a sort of certain historical importance. So he puts one on the coast where he can, as a lookout, and then another one sort of right in the middle of the island, and there's a sort of beacon between them. So he keeps all of his men in the centre of the island where they can't easily be surprised. And there's a sort of watch kept on, you know, anyone who's going to come and raid them, with the ability to send a message. So, I mean, he's clever. He's well organised. You know, defensively, his strategy is actually pretty good. And having made these forts, they start to construct whatever weapons they can. They gather driftwood. They take the nails out of the bits of wood and sort of turn them, you know, they bind them onto the end of driftwood to make spears. They collect lumps of sort of fist-sized coral that they can throw at people. And, you know, they're fortunate in that the way in which this island works is there's kind of a little tiny mini cliff of about 6 or 7 feet high from where the beach is to where the mainland of the island is. And that's the obstacle you've got to overcome. So if they're going to be attacked, you know, the defensive position isn't that bad because they can see the people coming. They have to cross a sort of half a mile of sort of mud flats to get to the shore and then climb this little mini cliff. And all the time you can be pelting them with rocks and, you know, kicking them and stabbing down at them with your makeshift spears. So it's not easy for Cornelius to deal with Hayes. But he has to do it. I mean, for 2 reasons. Firstly, as I said, you know, he's got to get rid of these people before the rescue ship arrives or he's in severe peril. And secondly, of course, you know, Hayes now, in fact, is in control of the complete water supply for the whole of the archipelago through Cornelius' own stupidity. So Cornelius' first plan, in fact, was to barter. He sent some of his confederates to offer to sort of trade some of the clothing and the food that they had for water. And Hayes refused to have anything to do with that and, in fact, seized several of the mutineers, and Cornelius himself was in fact captured in the course of this. So this changes the balance of the situation in the islands almost immediately. Hayes puts to death 3 of Cornelius's main lieutenants because they're just too dangerous to keep around, and he hurls Cornelius into this pit in the middle of the island, where he's kept under constant guard and forced effectively to just become a servant of the loyalists. They throw down birds on him, and he has to pluck the birds and before they can be cooked for the loyalist dinner. He's allowed to keep sort of 1 in every 20 birds or something like that is the deal that they have with him. So Cornelius is out of the picture. Now, this, of course, is good news and bad news for the good guys, because it's very much like, the position in World War II where the Allies are sort of thinking to themselves, is it a good idea to take out Hitler, or would it just mean that the Nazis get someone more competent in command? And this is what happens. In Cornelius's place, the surviving mutineers elect one of the soldiers, a guy called Wouter Laus, who is in fact a lot more competent than Cornelius when it comes to strategy. And he launches several attempts to overwhelm the mutineers by force, using the gunpowder that they have. And there were a couple of attempted attacks which Hayes fends off. And after a while, so we're talking now about maybe 2 months after the shipwreck, there's a final assault on Hayes's position. Everyone else has been wiped out by this point. The other 2 islands have been wiped out. So it's Cornelius's men against Hayes's men. Cornelius's men take everybody with them. The whole community, including the women, are all put on board these ships, and they sail off for the final climactic battle.
And in what has to be one of the greatest moments of good timing in world history, Pelsart shows up just in the nick of time.
I would never have dared to invent that. If I was writing a novel, you'd think this is just way, way too convenient. But yeah, Pelsart, this in itself is an incredible story. It's forgotten in the more incredible story. But, Pelsart and Jacobs make it to Batavia. That's an 1,800-mile voyage in an overcrowded boat with 40 people on board, including a sort of babe in arms, and maybe about a foot or 2 foot of freeboard across the Timor Sea and then around Java to Batavia. It's unprecedented until Captain Bligh's voyage after the Bounty Mutiny about 160 years later. It was, in fact, the longest sort of small boat open voyage that we know about. And they made it without losing a single person. And, of course, Pelsart is in absolute disgrace, not because anyone knows what's going on Batavia's Cove, but because he's lost a ship and 13 cases of silver. So, he's immediately ordered by the head of the VOC in Batavia, Jakarta, as I mentioned, is the same place, to go back and get basically the silver. If there's any survivors, pick them up as well, but you go and fetch that silver. So he's given a small ship and sent back south. And he spends quite a long time looking for the islands. Again, they didn't know the longitude, only the latitude, and they hadn't got that very closely. So he spent almost a month, in fact, sailing fruitlessly to and fro off the coast of Australia. And then finally one day sort of stumbled across the islands and saw smoke and realized that some people must still be alive. So he must have been pretty happy at that point. But as you mentioned, in fact, what's happened is he has interrupted the final battle between the loyalists and the mutineers. And it is just an incredible story. I can't help but feel it could potentially make a good film, in the sense that what happens is almost incredible. The mutineers are fighting on the far side of the island. So the loyalists, to keep the boats from the mutineers, have hidden them sort of 1.5 miles away on the far side of this island. So Hayes has to send a group of his men to go and get the sort of raft that they've built and across 1.5 miles island and then row for the ship. And at the same time, of course, the mutineers realise that if the good guys get to the ship first and tell Pelsart what's happened, they're dead, because the ship, of course, has got guns on it, a fully armed crew, and they're done for at that point. And what you effectively get is a race between the goodies and the baddies in their little handmade rafts to be the first to reach the ship, and they're closing in on it from both sides. And you can imagine Pelsart's sort of bemusement to say, what the heck is going on here? There are 2 boats approaching. Very fortunately for us, for justice and for history, because we would never have known what happened otherwise, Hayes's men make it just to the rescue ship first, and they're able to scramble on board and sort of gasp out their story just before the mutineers arrive on their boat. So when the mutineers pull alongside, there are several cannon trained on them. They're told to disarm themselves before they come on board, and after a rather tense standoff, they do so, and the mutiny is at an end.
So probably on the minds of many listeners now, what happens to Cornelius?
Well, he is put to the torture. The Dutch at this point used a form of water torture, which is not 100 miles away from waterboarding, essentially. So what would happen was that they would have built a sort of frame, almost like a door frame, which you could easily do from the available supplies of wood. And the Cornelius was strapped to this door frame, spread-eagled, with a sort of canvas collar put around his neck that was then sort of pulled tight under on his neck so that you could pour water into it and it wouldn't leak out at the bottom. And essentially what happens is you get some large jugs of water, clamber up a ladder that rests across this frame until you can reach him, and you start pouring the water into his collar. And as it comes up to your nose, the only way you can breathe is by swallowing it. And you swallow, and then they just top up the water, and you end up in this situation. I mean, it's again horribly described in the sources, where water starts leaking out of your eyeballs and sockets, and you become grotesquely distended. If you vomit it up, they just start again until you tell them what they want to hear. And of course, from the point of view of the story, the trouble is that Pelsart is very anxious to get a tale where he is not guilty and Cornelius is completely guilty. So it's as a historian, you have to wonder about any evidence that comes up from torture. And unfortunately, the way that the Dutch legal system worked at that time was that it was only evidence that was given under torture and then confirmed sort of freely the next day was the only sort of evidence acceptable. So, of course, what happened was that for the first few days, Cornelius would confess and then recover, and the next day he'd deny all the story that had come out under torture, and they'd just torture him again. And eventually he realised that they were going to keep doing this, and there was no point in just denying it. So one of these confessions stood, but they didn't sort of, as we would do now, sort of hear a load of evidence from the survivors, which would have been much, much more useful. And the only real sort of corroborating evidence we have, therefore, there are two letters, essentially. There's one that Bastians, the predicant, wrote after they got back to Batavia to some relatives at home, and an account that was written by one of Hayes's men. And those two do corroborate the story that came out under torture pretty much exactly. So I felt, from a historical point of view, it seems that it's reasonable to assume that the broad brush of what Cornelius said, and hence the story that I've just told you, is the truth, more or less. But Cornelius was tortured to give this. And I think that, again, it says something about Cornelius and about Pelsart too, that Pelsart did not feel safe in taking Cornelius back to face justice in Batavia. Again, you're talking about another month on board a ship and a guy with a silver tongue, and, the ability to persuade all sorts of people to do, really quite incredible things. And I don't think Pelsart thought it was a good idea to let Cornelius have another month on another ship to potentially foment another mutiny. So he decided to deal with Cornelius and several of his henchmen on the islands. They were hanged. Again, that's not the sort of modern neat hanging that we're talking there with a trapdoor and a quick broken neck. What we're talking about is a short drop and being strangled to death. And in Cornelius's case, because he was such a hideous criminal, he had his hands amputated beforehand. So he probably bled to death before he could, in fact, strangle to death. And he was just left sort of dangling from this makeshift gibbet on one of the islands with several of his companions, and only the lesser mutineers were then taken back to face the Dutch East India Company's justice in Batavia.
And Bastians, the minister whose family Cornelius had ordered slaughtered, actually offers last rites to Cornelius.
Well, yes, I mean, it's his job to do so, I suppose. I mean, I think that, again, I couldn't possibly have dared to write Cornelius' death scene if it wasn't what actually happened. But, Cornelius was completely unrepentant. So even after his hands had been amputated with chisels, and he's sort of forced to sort of clamber up this ladder to be hanged, he's turning and screaming, "Revenge, revenge," to anyone who'll listen. And the case seems to be that the other mutineers insisted, as far as they could insist on anything at that point, that he went first, because, again, they seem to have feared that, if they were hanged and Cornelius was left alive, he'd find some way of sort of talking his way out of trouble and might survive. And having got them into this situation where they were facing capital punishment, and, if they had any religious belief at all, they must have believed that they were certainly going to be going down below for the hideous crimes that they were responsible for. The one thing that they wanted at that point was to make sure that he was going with them.
So we're running a little short on time right now. So anyone who wants to know what happens to Pelsart, Jacobs, Christians, Wouter Laus, Webbe Hayes, and the creepy little cabin boy, Jan Pelgrim, should go out and buy your book. And for those who are interested in learning more about you and your book, where do you suggest they go?
Well, obviously, the book's easily available. It's still in print. You can get it from Amazon or other fine booksellers. It's called Batavia's Graveyard by Mike Dash, so not too difficult to find. I have a blog at mike-history.com where I write other stories of this sort, interesting history with all the interesting bits left in, I call it. So, I mean, not book length, but sort of shorter stories, but, equally eye-opening. I have to say that, of all the stories I've ever written, the Batavia one is my favorite because, when you're a writer, you're constantly told, when you're a historian, writer, you're told by your publishers, we want this to be more like a novel. And as a historian, you're always saying, well, it doesn't work that way. History is much more lumpy. There are missing bits and we don't have evidence and it's not it doesn't follow a novelistic structure usually. And the Batavia is the one story that does have a sort of beginning and a middle and an end and a hero and a villain and everything you would want to get in a novel. So it's my favorite. But there are other great stories on mike-history.com, which I'd love people to go and read.
Mr. Mike Dash, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the Batavia Mutiny and Massacre.
It's been a really interesting chat, and I'm glad to have had the chance to tell you a bit about the story.
I'm Eric Rivenis, and this has been the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. Find me on Facebook and at mostnotorious.com. And if you haven't done so already, please leave a rating for me on iTunes. I appreciate everyone. My parting advice, learn how to swim, because you never know when you'll be shipwrecked with a mad Dutch Anabaptist apothecary on a coal pile of an island off the Australian coast. Have a good day.
This is Peter on his motorcycle.
Whoa, the open road!
And this is Peter off his motorcycle.
Please move your paper off my desk. Thank you.
On his motorcycle.
I feel so alive!
Off his motorcycle.
I feel like we covered that already, so...
On.
Wow! Look at the ocean!
Off.
Look at this article I found about urban planning.
You're better on your bike. Progressive helps keep you on it. Get a quote in as little as 3 minutes at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.